I want to talk about your book. So,
Mm.
in the book, you challenge a lot of misconceptions about early human history. What did we generally assume, and what did we get wrong? Where did these misconceptions come from?
Well, it depends which particular misconceptions you're talking about, but I think a lot of our basic assumptions about human history are also assumptions about human nature. And it is possible to trace back where those particular assumptions originated in Europe. And a lot of them go back to what is sometimes called the Age of Discovery. It was really an age of discovery for Europeans in the Americas, the Indian Ocean. Obviously, the people who lived there already weren't discovering anything except Europeans. But for Europeans, this period from the late 15th century through to 16th, early 17th century was kind of explosive in many ways, not just commercially and militarily, colonies and that sort of thing, but also intellectually. One French historian wrote a wonderful book about it, which in English is called The Crisis of the Human Mind, the crisis of the European mind, sorry, because Europeans until that point had really only known a relatively limited number of possible ways in which to organize human life. Generally, these involved monarchy, they involved religion, and they involved a good many assumptions about what the possibilities and the limitations of existence on this planet could really be. And then suddenly, from the late 15th century onwards, Europeans are exposed to an incredible range of alternatives from everywhere, from China to Africa to the Americas. And some of those encounters could be sort of fitted into a pre-existing idea of how to classify
So, you're
other
talking about
people.
like a Eurocentric bias about.
Well, I don't think anyone at the time would have thought of it that way. I mean, we're talking about people organized into principalities, cities, kingdoms, who would have thought of themselves as Christians. They would have thought of themselves as subjects of the Holy Roman Empire, if you were Spanish or Portuguese. They would have thought of themselves as creating the first republic, if you were Dutch, so on. But the point is that there were certain kinds of people that Europeans encountered at that time who they sort of knew what to do with in legal terms. For example, Muslims, because you had a long history of the Crusades, and you had a very clear idea that these were people who were actively resisting and rejecting Jesus Christ and the teachings of the Gospels. They could be classed as infidels, and there were rules of engagement which were generally rather unpleasant. And of course, that went in the other direction too. The peoples of places like the Americas were a more interesting kind of problem. They would have been regarded as pagans, but they couldn't really be said to have rejected Christianity. And the same went for peoples of Southeast Asia, for example, who the Portuguese encountered from a certain point on. They just never seem to have thought about it or have even come across it. So you begin to have debates going on in Europe in places like Salamanca and Valladolid about the rights of these people who, generally speaking, are being slaughtered and persecuted on a very large scale. Not all European thinkers were in favor of that, so you begin to get debates going on, most famously Francisco de Vitoria, the School of Salamanca, saying, well, maybe there are certain things that all humans have, what you might call natural rights. And this becomes the basis of what people now call natural rights theory, natural law theory. And it's here that you get the beginning of a tradition in European philosophy of beginning these discussions with humanity in its state of nature. It's not history. I mean, nobody at that time had a clue what the earliest human societies were like. Their sources would have been the Bible, the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans. They could speculate. It was more like a rhetorical device. So you had some people like the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes during the English Civil War saying, well, let's assume as a kind of thought experiment that humans are innately, in their natural state, rather vicious, competitive, savage sort of creatures who will slaughter each other at the first opportunity. And that's your starting point, and then you build a story from there
Yeah.
about how to contain those impulses. In his
So you
case,
go back to that first assumption.
you go back to that first assumption. Other people started with the opposite assumption, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1753, comes up with the idea that originally human societies were very sort of simple and innocent and egalitarian. There was no private property. It's a kind of myth-making, but it's also a legal strategy. Obviously, it's also a fantasy. I mean, we know that humans are always more complex than that. They're never just one thing all the time. The interesting thing that my co-author and I noticed when we began working on this stuff is that these stories that were created 200-300 years ago are still with us. I mean, they still give us the overall shape of human history, into which people try to fit this massive data that floods in now at frightening speeds from all corners of the globe. In my field of archaeology, he was an anthropologist, also various fields of history, ethnohistory. The problem is it doesn't fit in the boxes anymore. I mean, the picture we have is so much more interesting, complex, but not necessarily complicated, but complex and fascinating. So we decided to, in a sense, just throw all that stuff out and start again. Although in the end we became so fascinated by why people in Europe started asking those questions in the first place, that also became part of the project.
What did you figure out about that?
Well, the case of Rousseau is particularly intriguing because he writes his famous essay, The Origins, the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, actually as the answer to an essay competition, which is announced by one of the most famous academies, the Académie Dijon in France of that time. Now, that time was the early 1750s, so we're still about 3 decades before the French Revolution. People are still living in the old regime. They're living in a society which is dominated by monarchy and the church. It's incredibly hierarchical. Everyone divided into ranks. Everyone has to know their position in relation to this hierarchy. And yet, the academy at that time thought that it was a good question to pose. And the question is, what are the origins of inequality in human societies, and is inequality a natural way for us to
What do you think?
be? Which is a very strange question to ask in
Yeah.
that milieu. Why were they asking that in the first place? And again, we found, this is the conclusion we came to, is that this has a lot to do with the encounters that are going on outside Europe. And this much larger world of ideas that Europeans are being exposed to finds its way back into European society. Obviously, there's a receptiveness to it. As I say, we're shortly before the French Revolution. People are questioning at great personal risk. They're questioning a lot of things that have been taken for granted about the nature of authority. But to do that at that time likely meant being imprisoned, tortured, and killed. So what you end up with is a kind of strategy, which a lot of writers used in the Age of Enlightenment, of taking these critiques of European society and placing them into the mouths of an imaginary person, an exotic imaginary figure, or what they would have referred to as a savage. What's so interesting, what we found, and we're certainly not the first people to remark on it, is that the content of these critiques has a basis which is not purely imaginary.
Yeah.
It actually does go back to these very real encounters that were taking place, not just between the French, but between the Dutch, the English, Jesuits, traders, colonists. and the indigenous populations of what today is basically the area from upstate New York into the Great Lakes region of Canada, people like the Haudenosaunee Nation, the Huron-Wendat, and so on. Because in those societies, Europeans encountered forms of freedom that were still completely unheard of in Europe, including women's freedoms, the freedom to divorce, but also societies that somehow managed to organize themselves without systems of capital punishment, without police, without magistrates, but which actually had much lower crime rates than the French colonies at the time. And reports came back, particularly in the Jesuit relations, which were very widely read in the salons of Paris and London and other centers at that time, which were very subversive, but also very attractive. And it's actually out of all that, as we try to sort of unpick the story and explain it in the book, that we end up with a question about the origins of inequality.
So as you pick apart the stories that we've been told for hundreds of years, you personally, what did you find really surprising or enlightening or change how you look at societies and how they're made up?
You mean once we got into the actual reconstruction of human history without those kind of assumptions? One example that really still intrigues me, and actually I just more recently did a whole sort of project about it, which was an exhibition, are these discoveries that were made in Ukraine before the Russian invasion. And there were quite a few international teams, even British, some German teams, working with Ukrainian partners up until that point. And what they were finding north of the Black Sea, between the Bug River and the Dnieper River, so we're on the grassy steppe of southern Ukraine, was evidence for a whole tradition of urban life, very early cities, which actually go back. So my training originally was really in the archaeology of the Middle East, and we've always been taught that that's where cities originated. Ancient Mesopotamia, what's now the lands of Iraq, Syria, neighboring regions, roughly 6,000 years ago. These sites in Ukraine are as old as that. They're as ancient as that. They're as large, spatially, sometimes even larger than the famous Mesopotamian cities like Ur and Uruk and Lagash and so on. But they're totally different. If you look at a plan of an ancient Mesopotamian city from that time, you see a central area like an acropolis with these great monumental buildings, which are actually not palaces, they seem to be temples. But there's very clearly a high center. And we don't actually know very much about what's going on around it. When you look at these Ukrainian cities, you have to flip the image. So you end up with something that looks like a donut with an empty center, big round bit in the middle where there's apparently nothing going on that anyone can trace. And then these great concentric circles of houses, all roughly the same size. It looks a bit like the inside of a tree trunk. Organized in these great concentric formations with no obvious center. There's also no evidence for things like burials with unequal wealth, or actually any kind of obvious structural inequality. They just haven't been able to find it. Even when they find a slightly larger building, it seems to be basically a sort of assembly place, rather than a place that was used for central administration, some kind of authority. And nobody's really known what to do with these settlements. You know, you want to look at them and say, well, this must be a city. It's the same size as all the other early cities in the Indus Valley and in Mesopotamia and in early China and so on. But then somebody always comes along and says, well, no, you can't call it a city. You say, well, why not? You say, well, it's got no center. You know, it's people come up with these sort of euphemisms. So it's an overgrown village or a mega site, popular, but not a city.
It's a town with dreams.
It's a town. It's a tiny hamlet with big dreams or something, but it's not a city. Which is, this is what kind of intrigued us, is that the way we kind of internally, mentally police our thoughts about what a city could be. And actually, it gets even more interesting because these cities, I'll call them cities, are located on the famous Chornozem soils, the black soils for which Ukraine is famous, which have been the other dream of so many invaders over the centuries. The most fertile soils in Europe, the soils that fed the democracy of Athens much later on through the ports of the Red Sea. But actually, this archaeological work was beginning to show something incredibly interesting. It's not conclusive yet, but there is a case to be made that these black soils are actually human creations. They are anthrosols, anthropogenic soils. In other words, they weren't there before these very large settlements existed in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. And it has even been argued by soil scientists and a Ukrainian-German team that worked at a site called Maidanetska that it was actually the existence and subsequent decay of these cities that triggered the process of soil formation, which is kind of mind-blowing because it implies a form of urban existence that actually enriches the land. We tend to think of urbanism as extractive.
As anti-nature.
Precisely. Yeah, I guess if I had to pick, well, I just did pick one thing.
Well, I mean, I want to go back to the concentric circles making up this city structure. Is there any discernible purpose for that structure?
Unfortunately, there's nothing by way of written sources. But the
Could it be like for
archaeologists,
defense to like confuse your enemy or something?
that was a
like
theory, and there are other features like ditches around some of these sites. Actually, every time somebody's tried to make that case, it kind of comes apart. What the archaeologists have managed to reconstruct with some confidence are what appear to be neighborhoods. So actually the concentric image is a bit of an illusion. And they've actually figured out that like a cake, that you put slices through it, these cities were actually divided into neighborhoods, and that each neighborhood had an assembly house, and that there seemed to be sub-units within the larger settlement. There's a debate about whether people lived there all year round or just seasonally. There is no city in the history of the world where everybody lived there all the time, every year. I mean, so, this is obviously a spectrum of possibilities. So yeah, there has actually been some quite remarkable progress in understanding how these places functioned. But there's also art. One of the really intriguing things about them, if you work like me in the Middle East, or if you work on one of these sites in Pakistan, like Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, the kind of materials people produced in the earliest cities in those regions are kind of familiar to us because they're slightly mass-produced. They're very samey, and if you look at the vessels people are using for everyday things like eating and drinking and serving food, there's already that sense of a society that's getting used to seeing lots of identical, like these two glasses. Well, most of human history, you would never see this. That's why a lot of cultures have fascinating myths about twins, because it was the only time you'd ever see two things that are exactly the same. There's nothing, I mean, that's different from, well, this isn't real, this is not natural, right? But if it was natural, if it were natural, you know what I mean. But these early cities elsewhere do seem to be going in already for that kind of standardization. The Ukrainian cities are different. They're more like sort of enormous artist colonies or something. So each house is producing its own very richly decorated style of pottery or its own kind of figurines. So there's an enormous amount of creativity going on at the domestic level. And that's kind of intriguing because it implies that you've got a society that has actually managed to scale up without creating uniformity, which I think goes against a lot of assumptions we tend to make about bureaucracy.
You mentioned earlier talking about an egalitarian society and what equality means. If we're going to look at the future just in the last couple of minutes, is it possible for us to undo what we've done to our culture to create such inequality? And is it possible for us to get back to a more egalitarian society? And if so, what would have to happen short of a miracle?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we need to get away from this idea of getting back to an egalitarian past because, frankly, no such thing really existed. I mean, one of the main arguments of our book is this idea that humans were sort of naturally egalitarian for most of human history is itself a myth. And it's actually quite a dangerous myth because it does imply that there is a kind of tipping point, the origins of inequality. Usually it's associated with the invention of agriculture, then the appearance of cities and so on. Actually, none of the evidence suggests this was really the case. So once you do away with that, I think you do at least become free to look at the evidence that's there and think about it in other ways. And I do think that has implications for the future because, when you talk about violence and inequality as being the natural outcome of something that happened tens of thousands of years ago, that's already a huge assumption about what may or may not be possible for our species now and in the future. And what it also does is take a lot of the violence and inequality of the present or the very recent past and sort of displace it onto periods of history that are so far back that there's clearly nothing we can conceivably do to reverse them. And apart from being factually incorrect, I think that's also psychologically pretty bad. In the same way that, people often go on about things like artificial intelligence and say, well, this thing's it's this innovation, it's gonna change everything, but we don't really know how. As if someone else was, doing it, which is also the sort of way that people talk about the past and things like the origins. Ever since Rousseau, he said, we sort of stumbled into it, and it turned out to be this dreadful mistake, but we couldn't possibly see where we were headed. It becomes a kind of self-defeating exercise in not knowing ourselves and not knowing what we're capable of, and then you pass it on to your children and they learn it in school and so I do think these things have contemporary implications. Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. We
Very
have
welcome.
time for just a couple of questions. If you've got yes, we've got a gentleman over here.
I've just recently finished Dawn of Everything. It's really a thought-provoking book, and when I was reading it, and I was reading all these interesting ideas about ancient cultures and how they behaved and what kind of everyday interactions did they have, I was constantly wondering what are the actual toolkits or methods of archaeology for understanding these very abstract everyday situations, and also how abstract the evidence and discussion should be from each other. So how abstract your thoughts should be after you having the raw evidence.
Yeah.
I think that should be.
Thank you. One of the nicest things about the reaction to our book is that a lot of people decide they might like to study archaeology or anthropology. I have an alarmingly large number of them showing up next week in London to begin. And the answer to your question
it's Indiana Jones in your book.
Yeah, I'm not going to do any advertising for the university, but in all honesty, the answer to your question takes about 3 years to learn. Then you get a BA, and then you keep going. And none of these things are resolved, but I think it's reasonable to say that roughly since the 1960s or 70s, my field has developed a pretty intense and sophisticated body of theory to process and interpret the kind of data that we deal with. And just like modern history, there's no consensus on anything. In the same way that people have different interpretations of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, people are bound to have different interpretations of the Neolithic period. The interesting thing in some ways about prehistory is that obviously the further back you go, the less evidence there is. The more the evidence that does exist lends itself to a kind of myth-making. It's very plastic, it's very malleable. You can turn it into these seductively simple stories. And a lot of the work we do in the book is to try and show that the simple stories don't work. They're full of holes. And it's not that we can definitively prove the other thing. We can't definitively tell you. Nobody can definitively tell you how one of these early Ukrainian cities functioned. If they tell you that they can, they're pulling your leg. But what you can say is that it probably wasn't that way or that way. And if you start doing that on a large enough scale, you find that some of these kind of dominant modes of thought, these very powerful myths that we all grow up with, are actually resting on very shaky sands. And that in itself can be quite liberating. And it comes out of the complexity of the evidence and the possibility for multiple interpretations.
That's a great question. I think we have time for one more question.
I haven't read your book, but I'm quite curious about it. So you mentioned about stories and religious texts. So based on the researches you did, were there any books like texts, like religious texts that influenced your research? And if there is, which of the books? Because there's lots of like religious texts like Bible, Quran, and so this is the question.
Actually, I think the best way I can answer your question, since you haven't read our book, is that we draw an analogy between the standard narrative of human history and the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Old Testament, which, as you know, involves a fall from grace, which is actually kind of built in to this rather familiar idea that once upon a time we lived in the Garden of Eden. In a sense, there was no private property, everything was egalitarian, and then something happened to change all that. It's kind of hardwired into that question about the origins of inequality, and I think that does appeal to people when they hear it, partly because it is also part of our spiritual and theological inheritance to think that way, that once upon a time we were this way, and then something happened to change all that, and it was bad. And now we have to spend all our time either trying to sort of claw our way back to it or containing the poison that seeped into our lives at that point, which is really a theological discussion. And actually, if I remember correctly, our book actually begins by talking about theology and the way that most standard narratives of human history are actually framed around theological questions like, are we as people innately good or bad? That's not actually an anthropological or a historical question. It's a theological question. And yet you'll find it in the works of Steven Pinker, Yuval Harari, etc.
Give it up for David Wengrow, everybody.
Thanks a lot.